I think we are seeing everyone come in, so I take the liberty of start. Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in today on the seminar at ECIPE. Today we have a very topical topic. Perhaps one might say it's one of the most defining policy questions, at least in terms of trade and economic policy of our times, for a number of reasons. And a friend of mine in the European Commission always talk about it as the new black of policies. And there are, I think, very good reasons why foreign subsidies has become such an issue, because of it is on the nexus of global governance and EU policy that raises a number of interesting questions, as well as we see now a global environment of returning to state interventionism, public support, and not least activist industrial policy. When I got into the policy space, tech industry was always thought of as somewhere, at least one corner of the market where we actually have free market policies and reasonable amount of free trade and open trade. But I think it's fair to say that geopolitical gambits and competition in the geopolitical competition in the tech space, I should say, has really manifested itself and leads, not least, the question about resilience and good politics, not least, have made it very attractive to look into subsidization of local players. Now, there is a great English trope about double-edged swords, and not least, this is very much for the EU, a double-edged sword. On one hand, I think it's clear that the EU member states have its fair share of subsidies, although they are mostly in R&D and non-discriminatory. But also we have very good disciplines for our internal state aid, and which makes us to a certain extent also vulnerable. And I think this is in this context, we are really welcoming the proposal that has been put forward by DG Competition, and that may fill a number of gaps for us in terms of this very, very vulnerable space. And we have therefore invited Mr. Eddie De Smitter of DG Comp, and is the head of unit for the international relations, to talk about the proposal, but also more broadly about the circumstances. We also have a number of representatives from the European industry, and I will bring them and also give their word to them soon. And we'll have a very open debate without no speeches, no PowerPoint presentations. So hopefully we're going in for a very lively debate. So Eddie, if I may start with you, how big of a problem is actually foreign subsidies for the integrity of the single market? What is the problem formulation here? We already have a number of disciplines against subsidies, internal and externally. We have the WTO SCM. And so what's the problem? And how big is tech of that problem?
Yeah, good. Thanks for the question, Hasuk, and for the invitation to be with you today. Morning, everyone. The problem is exactly what you just have been referring to, the fact that the global rules on subsidies are what they are today, and namely very limited, largely to what we have in the ASCM. And even there, we all know very well that, for example, the transparency provisions of the ASCM are not necessarily respected by all WTO members. We try in the European Union to modernize the WTO subsidy rules, because we still believe that that is the best forum in order to have fair rules globally. And that's clearly an effort that is taking some time already and will still take some time. And the question is whether we should sit back and wait until the WTO subsidy rules are modernized, and at the same time then having having foreign subsidies distorting the internal market. As you said quite rightly, subsidies are given in the European Union as well. I mean, that is not a secret. And if it is one, it is badly hidden.
Especially given that the politicians like to actually make grand statements about them. So I hope they are not a secret, because they will be terrible liars.
Well, you know, they're also not a secret because they are notified, and the Commission is controlling them and under very strict rules, as you were just saying. And that is very different from foreign subsidies, which are largely secretive. The transparency rules of the ASCM don't work properly as they should. And beyond goods, there is lots of services also where subsidies are being given directly, indirect subsidization.
I should maybe add here for the audience that services subsidies are not a part of the existing international agreements, including the WTO, just to clarify. Sorry, Eddie.
No worries.
I'm on my didactic mood today.
We're still waiting for the GATS trigger, the hook which is in the GATS to start a discussion on subsidies. We wait for that to be triggered. But so there are subsidies out there, foreign subsidization, of which we are largely unaware. Sometimes they pop up very clearly in a European context. We've seen subsidization in public procurement proceedings, also in some acquisitions, and in other contexts. And there's nothing one can do about that. And it means that companies who don't get that foreign subsidization are competing on the internal market on unequal terms with other undertakings that do receive such foreign subsidization. So we thought that it was fair to ask for some equal treatment, and so restoring the level playing field in the internal market by also ensuring that all companies operating on the internal market, and there are lots of companies, both domestic and foreign, and we hope that will stay that way, but that they compete on the merits, and not that they are getting a benefit due to a foreign subsidization, which, if it would have been given by a member state, would never have passed the test of the Commission. So that's a bit what the stakes are. There is this gap, as you referred to, for the moment in our toolbox, so that we try to remedy. How big is the problem? We know that the problem exists, and we get anecdotal evidence from industry, but no one can tell you how big the problem is. We see subsidization has been increasing globally over the years. I would be very surprised that subsidization didn't reach the internal market via the undertakings that are subsidized. But because the data on foreign subsidies is being so obscure, it's very, very hard to quantify precisely. But as I said, the increase of subsidization, there are sufficient data available on that makes one be very confident that those subsidies also influence the competitive process on the internal market. Hence the proposal.
I mean, that's, I think, evidently clear. I mean, I think it's one of your own document that also quotes the same number that OECD points to somewhere between 20 billion and $70 billion. And that's in annual subsidies, which sounds extremely little in my ears, because if I look at the US Innovation and Competitiveness Act, one law alone is actually up to 200 billion in federal spending, in addition to actually sub-central levels subsidies that we are not even counting in the OECD. So obviously, if you take into that, and plus also a few planned economies who are really big in subsidization, and as you mentioned also our own R&D subsidy, there's no way that we could arrive to such a low number. But we're gonna bring the conversation also from a general perspective also to the tech, because I think this is really, as I said in the onset, an area where we have seen public intervention. And I should also say that public interventions are not by default bad. I mean, they are necessary to maintain a level playing field as well as a market economy. And there are genuinely good reasons why you can subsidize an industry if you can. The question is more about how we do them. And also, we are not here to point out any country or east or west. We have major subsidies on both sides and also in the center where we stand, as we said. But I think we can be very clear that one of the subsectors that is always brought up within tech in this context is probably semiconductors. I mean, even in my space in policy writing, I've seen maybe 100 colleagues go on and suddenly become an expert on semiconductors and state policy on semiconductors. So that probably tells you a little bit of where we are. But one thing that I think the general policy audience is not maybe aware of is that Europe is truly a giant in this field. We are the tech innovators, we are the leaders. I'm very, very delighted actually to have one of the company speakers as one of the European companies as the first speaker amongst the European industries. And I would like to invite Mr. Wouter Baljon, who is the head of government and external affairs of ASML, which is basically, you are the maker of the infrastructure that basically runs the entire tech industry. Sorry if it sounds a little bit like advertising, but it is really true that people are perhaps not that aware of the fact that a company like yours and a couple of other European companies who may have joined in, and I also invite you to raise your hand and comment as well, are really big in the space. And I would assume that you are both excited, but also very worried about some of the interventions we see from both central and sub-state level of governments. We mentioned already USICA. There has an element of Chips for America, which promise, I don't know, did try to look at the number before, but 50 billions on local US chip making. And also, in addition, we have China spending 10 billion per year on chipsets alone. I mean, this is big numbers. And so what can you say? How big of this is a problem / opportunity for ASML?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks so much, Ozuk, for the introductory words and for the advertising. That means that I don't have to do it. No, this, I mean, I think it's very interesting as a Dutchman, sort of working for a company headquartered in the Netherlands, that, you know, we talk so much about subsidies, which have a bit of a negative connotation to them, and sort of the free market economy that the Netherlands claims to be. No, but all jokes aside, I think sort of ASML is kind of, well, depending on how you look at it, we're either at the start or in the middle of sort of semicon production. Like, we don't produce chips ourselves, but we provide machinery that enables it. And looking at it from our perspective, it's pretty, it's almost intimidating to see the amounts of spending that have been announced to your point, the US. You know, we see China, Taiwan, Korea, and Europe, quite frankly, is pretty far behind. You know, we hear Commissioner Breton talking a lot about sort of billions of euros that are coming to our sector, but if you look around right now, what has been committed specifically, it's not that much. And if, you know, we want, sort of in line with the EU Digital Compass, to double the amount of chip production on European soil, then something needs to happen. From ASML's perspective, we've always viewed subsidies as something that is a nice input to our R&D activities. What is interesting for us to see is that there's quite a few European players that are also looking at subsidies for operational difficulties. I think there's not a day that goes by that we don't see worrying signs of chip shortages and what it means to factories across Europe. However, the way that we look at it, subsidies need to address market failure. They need to address a problem that a company cannot solve with its own, sort of as part of its own household activity, so to say. So as an industry and a European player in that industry, we really hope that Europe gets its act together quite quickly, and that there is a smart form of subsidizing. The numbers in many ways don't really matter as long as it happens in a targeted and a smart way. That's sort of a brief takeaway. I'm sure that the discussion further on will provide more opportunities to chip in.
Well, that's great, Wouter, but I'm just going to ask you to chip in right now. One of the key problems we see is the fact that it's not so much a question about having access to production. It's actually a question about having domestic access to production, meaning that if you look at both in the European as well as the Chinese, the US and Chinese, as well as some of the European initiatives, it's about securing your own supply. And exactly as you said, Wouter, we have different elements of the value chain, but also we have different ways of subsidizing. Yeah. So depending on, perhaps this is a leading question, but depending on where you are in that value chain, it determines whether actually subsidies are a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah. No, and I think this is where we come from as ASML, and I mean, it's kind of sort of self-serving, I admit this, but Europe needs to strengthen its strengths through subsidies, in our view. And there's a small number of key activities in the semicon space where Europe is really strong. I mean, we have low power electronics, sort of lithography, what we stand for ourselves. There is process technology where we have a world leader in the form of IMEC. I think there's already quite a few strengths that can be strengthened to subsidies, and sort of building an entire European ecosystem, in some cases from scratch, is going to be very, very costly. And the question is whether Europe can actually come up with the funds to do that. So from our perspective, sort of going back to what I said earlier, we might as well spend it smart.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in more industry voices, and I'm primarily and first of all going to ask the European industry to speak. As you can see, I already single out someone, and I hope, Benedict, you are getting ready to put your camera on, but while you're getting prepared, I'm going to bring the question back to Eddie because of the question on smart subsidizing and the increasing pressure to localize production. I mean, I'm just going to mention IPCEI and semiconductors, and I'm just going to be quiet right there, and I just ask for your reflections.
Well, I'm sure that Wouter is very well aware, and you probably as well, Hosuk, of the IPCEI, the important project of common European interest that we have on microelectronics, which also has semiconductors in it. And that's probably an example, I hope that Wouter will agree, an example of the smart subsidization that he is referring to. He actually made a very good point by saying that there is subsidization also going on of operational difficulties. And as you know, under the EU state aid rules, that kind of operating aid is very difficult to pass the test of the Commission, if at all. And for companies then to have to compete with an undertaking that receives operating aid from a foreign jurisdiction, whereas you are not able to get it from a member state, that is exactly that unlevel playing field that I'm referring to. You may have noticed that I'm not talking about domestic undertakings or foreign undertakings, because that is not the issue. We are looking at the origin of the money. Is the money coming from a third jurisdiction, or does it come from the member states? And we know very well that there are also domestic EU undertakings that are getting money from abroad. And also those we cannot control under our state aid rules. And those European companies with foreign money compete with other companies on our market on unequal terms. So it's good to keep in mind that this is not targeted at foreign undertakings, making life difficult on foreign undertakings. No, it's exactly what Wouter is saying. We're looking for smart subsidization on the continent, whatever the origin. We are doing that already on the state aid control in the EU. And now we want to make sure that foreign subsidization that is distortive, because it is not looking at market failures, but rather as at keeping a company at all costs alive within the market. And that is what the proposal is about.
Can I just quickly chip in, because I'm really happy that Eddie mentioned the I word, so IPCEIPE. It's a very smart instrument, and even though ASML itself has not been a beneficiary of sort of the microelectronics IPCEIPE, that's sort of, this is round 2. There was a round 1 where earlier this month the Bosch facility in Dresden was opened, which was a beneficiary of this funding. And this is the kind of thing that I think we as Europe should all be applauding, that the state-of-the-art facility is being opened in Germany with with important input from a European subsidy instrument. So that is this a bit of cheerleading I wanted to throw in this conversation. Definitely.
I'm going to ruin the cheerleading a little bit by saying that I'm going to call my friends in the Beijing Fair Trade Bureau and the USTR after this call and ask them if they think it's such a smart initiative, but I'll leave it at that. But I think it is a great example that we all do have this initiative because we have very similar political concerns in the end. And also, it's not necessarily always about what is legal or illegal or moral or immoral. This is also sometimes a question of what is actionable, and exactly as we were saying, and what can you actually prove. On that note, Benedict, are you ready to turn on your microphone? Benedict Wiedenhofer is the Senior Advisor of Business Europe, and I think you really represent a wider interest in this question, because obviously, Europe is not a self-supplying in tech, and we are, but also, as we've seen, a great tech vendor. That means that we have actually a balanced interest in buying subsidized cheap stuff, as well as remain competitive. It must be a pretty difficult conversation in the organization. I mean, please do come in on how you see the pros and cons of the foreign subsidy regulation.
Thank you, Hasso. I don't see how to turn my camera on, but I'll leave it just with my voice for now. Now, as Business Europe, we actually very much support the instrument on foreign subsidies because we think it's critical that European companies have fair competition within the single market, and basically all companies within the single market face fair competition. The thing is that state aid has been tackled within the single market for with regards to state aid that is granted by European countries, but foreign state aid is not covered by the current EU legal framework, and that has created a problem, especially in the last couple of years, where we saw increased activity of foreign subsidized enterprises in the EU market, and that has exposed this current legal gap. Now, of course, the foreign subsidies instrument should focus on the problem and not on any specific country that grants subsidies. But nonetheless, one thing our members have highlighted, one concern our members have highlighted, is increased activity of Chinese state-owned companies, particularly in recent years. that because the People's Republic of China has very extensive subsidization programs that are linked to, for example, the main Made in China 2025 strategy, that are linked to its 5 years plans, and so on. And with the increased activity of Chinese companies in Europe, but also in other third countries, this has become an increasing issue for European companies as well, both within the EU and in third countries. And the current 5-year plan that was adopted by the People's Republic of China this year continues the course that was set by the China 2025 strategy, and it identifies 7 frontier technologies in which China wants to gain global leadership. And many of these are you know, the issues we're talking about today. They include issues such as integrated circuits, next generation artificial intelligence, genetics and biotechnology, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, the dual circulation strategy will help substitute imports of high-tech inputs into China and replace them with help replace them with domestic alternatives, and it will be accompanied by market access barriers for foreign companies, very likely, and subsidies for Chinese companies. So it's a very relevant area that will have major impacts in the coming years. And since Europe pointed to this problem, for example, in our 2020 report, the EU and China addressing a systemic challenge, where we called, amongst other things, for an instrument that would ensure that the activity of Chinese state-owned companies on the single market is competitively neutral. And that is why we very much welcomed the white paper on foreign subsidies that was published last year. We, of course, believe that this is but one instrument, and it needs to be part of a more comprehensive approach by the European Union on this. We also need to work with partners multilaterally to create, for example, subsidies, updated rules on subsidies need to be a major part of WTO reform. We need to work with like-minded countries, such as the US and Japan, on industrial subsidies, possibly to launch a plurilateral initiative in this area to increase the pressure, because ultimately, of course, we would like to that China signs up for it as well. We need to discuss it bilaterally with China, and so on. And you mentioned it before, so we also depend, of course, on an open economy, on imports, and so on. So it's very important that we signal that you know, this instrument is not directed at any specific country, is not discriminatory towards any specific country. It must be in line with WTO rules and so on. But it is something we very much supported. We are currently working on a more detailed position paper on the legislative proposal that has been published recently. Thank you.
You're muted, Hosuk, you're muted.
A year and a half on, and I still don't remember to take the mute off. Anyway, Benedict, thank you so much for this, and I'll ask you to stay online with us as long as you can, and feel free to join us in the conversation going forward. But I think you're pointing to a couple of interesting questions that I'd like to ask all of you regarding, first of all, the question about deterrence and how we actually shape other countries' behavior. Benedict got the China genie out of the bottle. We have said that this is actually a global issue and not always a problem. But it is very true that China, for example, is, you don't have the same transparency because there is no notification. And that also entails something in terms of burden of proof. And I think Eddie knows what I'm pointing to, the fact that we can't prove that there are subsidies. And therefore, sometimes the policy of other countries have been that we assume that you are subsidized until the reversal has been proven when it comes to non-market economies. And the question, once again, about deterrence. Is foreign subsidy regulations going to be enough? And also, you pointed a question, Benedict, about third markets, because the problem is that even though we may safeguard the single market, we may not get rid of the subsidies unless we take them actually to dispute or to a negotiation. So the question is, once again, how much is a deterrence? I'm going to ask you, Eddie, and I'm going to also ask a couple of people in the trade policy community to jump into the conversation after this. So I think people may know who I'm pointing to. So I'll leave it to Eddie to respond regarding burden of proof, deterrence, and third market issues. And Benedict, feel free to jump in now as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vasuk, and Benedict for what you just said. And I fully subscribe to what you just mentioned about the foreign subsidy regulation not being sufficient. I agree very much.
Hey, I never said that.
It is, I mean, in itself, sorry to say, but if one would have had a good global system on subsidy control, covering broad fields with real transparency, I think that is in fact where we need to get to. Benedict was referring to the modernization of the WTO and the ASCM, but maybe, as I mentioned before, also triggering that GATS part, so that also services are being covered. And we have in our February communication on the trade policy review, indeed mentioned the idea of having possibly a plurilateral agreement. And we are working together with the American and Japanese colleagues, see what we can do to bring that discussion at the global level, to bring that forward, because that is probably the only forum where one can ensure a global level playing field. We try, in the absence of WTO reform, and to do things also via our bilateral agreements, where we bring subsidy provisions into those. This instrument is being proposed because the global modernization is not delivering. Can we change the foreign subsidies attitude in third countries? Actually, also, that is something that can be done only through global rules. What we want to ensure is that those foreign subsidizations are not distorting the internal market. That's as far as our competence goes. I cannot tell a third country, you should subsidize in this or that way. That is something that can be arranged at global level, or maybe in a bilateral agreement. But as a European Union, we are competent to say, you, as a third country, if you subsidize in a way that is distortive on my internal market, then I have a say on that. I can protect the level playing field in the European Union. I cannot change subsidy rules abroad. In how far is that deterrent? I'm not sure that that deterrence is the objective here. The objective is level playing field on the domestic internal market. There is obviously, as you said quite rightly, and there is an issue on that has to do with transparency. And so to become aware of subsidization and their distortive effects, you may have seen in our draft regulation that we have put in a number of tools in order to find evidence on that, on the foreign subsidization and on the distortive effect that may have. And we hope that the tools that we have put in there will suffice to bring those subsidies to the front.
Very good point. Benedict, would you like to come back on these reflections? I mean, it's not a deterrence, but it certainly sounds like a leverage. And you also mentioned the trilateral, and we have perhaps reason to come back to the trilateral because it's now very much a question of if we want to have a renewed and reformed system, the subsidy discipline and SOE disciplines are very much going to be a part of the new constitution, if you like. It's a take it or leave it deal. And the door is open for anyone to work with us. That's at least the message we hear from the ministers. Benedict, what does your business say?
Thank you, Husuk. Yes, indeed, we would agree with that assessment. The foreign subsidies instrument is one part of, a more global strategy to approach this issue, which consists both in work with on a multilateral level to reform the WTO and create disciplines in this area, and also work with like-minded partners to advance more quickly on this and increase leverage. It also consists of unilateral measures such as the creation of this instrument, and in bilateral cooperation with countries such as China to address these problems bilaterally. We saw, for example, that the comprehensive agreement on investment that was concluded with China at the end of last year includes provisions that would increase transparency on subsidies in China. So that would also, of course, contribute to the usability to use the future foreign subsidies instrument. And the instrument itself is very important because it includes the possibility for the EU to gather information on foreign subsidies. And we've heard in the conversation before that the lack of information on the scale of foreign subsidies is the major problem in this area, because they are not notified, because it's very hard to assess how big the problem is. Now, this instrument would address this issue by obliging companies that in bids and mergers and acquisitions and procurement processes above certain thresholds to provide this information proactively, and also give the Commission the possibility to request this information. And that is an important way to tackle the lack of information we have and to make it an efficient instrument. Now, of course, it will also create a cost for companies, and we are very aware of that. And that is why in our reply to the public consultation to the white paper on foreign subsidies, we stressed that it is key that the instrument is focused and efficient, and does not impose an undue administrative burden on companies, and neither on public authorities, because they will need to do all the assessment work, right? So it's important that the instrument is focused and that the administrative burden is minimized, but effectiveness needs to be ensured. Thanks.
All good comments, and I should just add as a small data point that U.S. Department of Commerce hires thousands of Chinese-speaking auditors who are Native American, born in the U.S. and U.S. passport holders who speak Chinese fluently, who knows everything about Chinese accounting rules. Well, at least we speak English. So there is a natural, let's say, difference in terms of our understanding of the economies. But I think both Eddie and Benedict has pointed to the trade track versus the competition track, which is the reason I'm going to bring in the next speaker, which is Pasi Varanma from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And I know that I put you on spot, and Pasi, I owe you a drink for that, but I'm going to take the blame and go ahead anyway and ask you. I mean, we already have a countervailing duties in Europe. And we also know that this is a power or a veto, if you like, that European member states have a little bit of a torn attitude towards. On one side, they can be coerced by third countries, but at the same time, they don't want to see the powers disappear to competition policies and Brussels. Is there friction between competition policy and trade policy here, or am I imagining things?
Well, this is a. I hope you can hear me, and I take you up for the drink offer later on. I'm just. I mean, as I have said to Eddie as well before, I think that the foreign subsidies distortion on in the single market, I think it's on theoretical level, it is a thing that we need to address. I really would want to see further down the line clear evidence of that impacting the competition in the single market. And I mean, we have been talking earlier that we should not be imitating China in terms of subsidizing in the single market or on the European level. And I think we need to be careful that when we introduce this instrument, that we still maintain and uphold the market competition in the single market. I think on if we are thinking of the remedies there, I would want to see perhaps on the subsidy side really taking up the ASCM offered possibilities through the dispute settlement at the WTO, and then of course negotiations as mentioned by others, because I think there are certain risks anyway with the instrument we are toying with or will be introducing later on, that there will be differing views as to the rightfulness of the instrument, and so we might end up seeing disputes and countermeasures perhaps by other countries on what we are doing. And we have to then consider how useful that situation were in terms of recovery for the EU. I mean, this is a sort of a brief brainstorming from my part. I think this is this is an interesting avenue that we are going down, and in the end, it still doesn't address the problems that we have outside of Europe in terms of subsidization. And I think we are all agreeing that. Thank you, Hosuk, on that part.
Well, very good point. And I think we are basically homing on the same question here. So I'm going to bring Eddie, Benedict, and Wouter back online in case you want to say something. And I'm going to prepare the next speaker to come on online as well. But generally, I mean, is there I don't want to call it friction, but it's almost like we are graduating towards competition policy because we can't seek the effects we want in trade policy. But also at the same time, Wouter and Benedict, do you have any preference in terms of we actually do it unilaterally or whether we negotiate? Does business actually have a preference for multilateral trade outcomes or unilateral or bilateral outcomes? I mean, does it matter, or is it just about anything that shoots the bear? Eddie, you want to go first?
I was about to jump in, but
okay, hello. Let's go with Wouter. We're going to give Eddie a few more seconds.
Well, in that sense, I can be really brief. I think sort of we are a global company, active pretty much in any jurisdiction that matters from a semicon perspective. So we would always advocate a multilateral solution, how difficult it may be, but that is for us always the preference. I think sort of bilateral discussions have the tendency to create friction, which we don't always appreciate as a globally operating business. So that's just a reflex that I wanted to share.
Benedict, Eddie, whichever goes first.
Happy to come in. Thanks, Tosuko. I fully agree with Wouter. For Business Europe, of course, the multilateral solution on this would be the optimal solution, because if all countries, signed up to certain rules, certain disciplines on foreign subsidies to increase transparency on foreign subsidies, that would be, the best possible outcome. Any bilateral instrument is just a second best solution, and a way to create leverage in the end. And the way to create leverage in order to increase the possibility for a multilateral outcome in the end, and also in order to a way to address the problems in the meantime, because a multilateral outcome on this is, of course, more of a medium to long-term thing. So in the meantime, we need to have ways to tackle problems that come up. There is, of course, a problem that friction is created. This is why we stress so much that the instrument needs to be WTO compliant. And I guess also a diplomatic effort on the side of the EU will be necessary, where it explains to its major trading partners what it intends with this instrument to avoid misunderstandings and so on, and to also explain them in which way it will work and that it will be WTO compatible. Okay.
Yes, also I agree with both Wouter and Benedict. A multilateral solution is to be preferred. And the evidence of that is also in our draft regulation, namely where we say that where an issue falls within the realm of the ASCM, the regulation will not apply. So clearly the regulation in its draft gives precedence to this multilateral solution. And that is why we need to continue our efforts on improving that, and in parallel, as Benedict says, make sure that the internal market keeps protected from unfair competition, that we can ensure the level playing field that we are having here. I hear both Pasi and also Benedict referring to the WTO compatibility. That goes, of course, without saying. And most of our efforts in the past months was exactly to make sure that the draft regulation was WTO compatible. So we're very confident on that front.
I was going to plan to actually let a speaker come in and talk about another field of tech and WTO, but I'm also allowing another speaker to very brief if she wants to come in. And it's Eva Baruskaite, who is actually a former chair of the WTO Subsidies Committee. And I'm going to be hated for calling out everyone I know in Geneva and Brussels in this way without actually asking for permission first. But I never went into this business to become a popular person, and I never was. So I'm going to call on you, Eva, before I move to Carolina and talk about the TBT and the 5G issues surrounding this. But I'm going to just allow you to briefly come in if you want to and say a few words about what you heard about the multilateral solutions versus the unilateral. And also, I should add that you were also attending the OECD meetings on subsidies, on which, if I remember correctly, China is not a member or part of, but United States is. So, Eva.
Indeed, and hello everyone. Thank you, Hosuk, for plugging me in, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this excellent discussion. And as someone who is not a delegate anymore and not a chair anymore, I will also not be in a business of making friends when I will say that that WTO compatibility might not be such a holy cow as we try to think that it is, because over the last years we have been quite clear about the fact that the SCM agreement is missing certain elements, and maybe has a couple of them too much. I have been listening to business saying that look, in the current environment, the state might have a role in encouraging the R&D, and this is certainly something that at least some governments indicated recently they would want to have a look at. So the review of SCM rules is brewing, and what the European Union and I guess the Trilateral Initiative was aiming to have is actually the review of that. So just plugging into the discussion about the current instrument, I will also say that I fully agree that this is just a second best, just like elements of our trade defense system is. And as our trade defense system has shown already, being reactive to the subsidies is not too helpful when it comes down to aiding our companies to have a decent level playing field. Even more so, as many people will have said, the remedies normally come way too late, and they address the effect of that subsidies that have already reached the recipients. And the products have already reached the European markets. Therefore, this is a problem of global subsidization, which definitely demands a global solution. And as a WTO is not really known as a fast mover, those efforts should normally be taken in parallel at least. Whereas we see that the trilateral action is kind of losing its steam. Therefore, the good question for a community who was waiting for this impulse to happen is, so when is the European Union and the partners gonna come? And when can we expect to start the substantial discussion on what is missing? So whereas I must compliment the Commission on taking the steps to actually look at the protection of single market, yet at the same time, if we are speaking about being the leaders and taking the leadership in our trade policy review, we actually must walk this talk. I'll stop here now, and I'll see if I can chip in later on.
Yeah, please do stay online for us, and we'll keep you up here in the panel. Does anyone else, including Carolina, would like to come in on Eva's comment? And as you hear, the tone is much more polite in Geneva than it is in Brussels. So, and also more eloquent. Does anyone want to come in? Otherwise, I'll just segue to Carolina, because Carolina is the partner of a law firm in Stockholm called MSA, who has been writing extensively about the link between TBT, standardization, and subsidies. And we have sort of done work in the same field within 5G. And I did mention before about the US Innovation and Competitiveness Act. We also have an element there which actually goes towards 1.5 billion in subsidies towards US-made telecom equipment. In the past, we've had problems with China, once again, I'm sorry, which was concerning export subsidies and export credits back in 2011 that almost led to a anti-subsidy investigation. This is a pretty big field as well. Has problem ever solved itself? Is it getting worse? Or are we shooting ourselves in the foot from the West by replicating state capitalist practices? There are a number of views around this, and there are also people who say that we need to spend money on new tech to avoid Chinese equipment. What does the law say? I should ask a lawyer, perhaps.
Thank you, Husok, and thank you for being here. It's a very interesting discussion, I must say. As Husok mentioned, we've been working on the WTO TBT agreement and technical specifications under that agreement to look at, for instance, ORAN, to see if what could be, I'll explain that very briefly, but basically looking at new standards in 5G that might or might not be WTO compatible. Now that I'd say is basically we're looking at a completely separate set of rules when it comes to the TBT, but nonetheless, if you're looking at taking on new standards in 5G and at the same time providing very broad subsidies, there might be a combination here, 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 in exponential gravity under the SM. I just like to take a step back, just to comment on what Husek asked me to comment on. What does the law say? And if I just bear with me for a moment, the more I'm looking at this and the more I'm hearing is basically, I see the area where the European Commission has proposed is sort of like a blind spot. It's not regulated at the WTO level, not sufficiently at least to be say it's compatible or not compatible. So I find that there's more of a leeway here to actually regulate than we're not questioning the WTO system. We're filling in the gaps basically from a legal perspective. That's how I see it. And if we take even one step further back, is the WTO, we've agreed to let goods and services flow freely or as freely as possible under the WTO. What's happened with the lack of involvement, that we haven't seen any development on GATS, is that services is lacking behind in regulation. So on the one hand, we've committed to allowing foreign products, physical products into our market and services into our market. But it's only with regard to products that we actually have this countervailing system and the WTO dispute settlement. We have this enormous Airbus Boeing case, which like took such much time and energy from the whole discussion that I'm wondering, yeah, we finally settled that, or that's calming down, and maybe the EU and the US and Japan can come up with new proper multilateral rules. That would be, of course, ideal. So just taking a step back, that on services and going back to tech, what is tech? A lot of the value, a lot of the big bucks is not in physical products. It's in data, in services, and data flows. And there we sort of opened ourselves and said, this can be traded freely. We've committed to that under GATS, but we don't have any subsidy regime regulating that. So I think the more we go towards digitalization, the more we go towards services, this combination, Internet of Things, it's really there that we need to be focused on having a level playing field. So I might stop there, but I would concur with everybody in this reasoning that it's not a question of this being, trying to navigate between really difficult rules and finding a compatibility here with WTO. It's more about the basic fact that we committed to freer trade in services and products, and now we're sitting here with an unregulated territory, and the EU's moving one step ahead in this chess game of regulation, which I think is a good thing.
I'll just chip in, Carolina, and say, as a former GATS delegate, that services are a remedy at the source, not at the border.
Yeah.
You can countervail for technical reasons. You can countervail subsidies flows, but you can still, under the WTO rules, address them at the source. Of course, those disciplines are relatively weak. We are now venturing to a very deep trade rather than tech or competition policy, but there seems to be quite a broad consensus around the fact that we are filling the gaps and we are doing second bests. And I think, Eddie, was it you said it? But I was going to say that, if you only want the best solutions and you can't live with second best solutions, you shouldn't be in politics and you shouldn't be in the policy making, or you definitely shouldn't be in Brussels. That's one thing that I think we can say for sure. We have encouraged people to raise their hands and say and jump in, or message me if you want to come up to the podium. Do we have any further speakers? Otherwise, I'll ask the panelists who are still with us for the final comments, perhaps. Do we have any takers? We have one question about developing countries and the dimension to the foreign subsidy regulations. So Eddie, I might ask you to address that question. And also, if any one of the other speakers have heard similar concerns, I'll ask you to address as well. But any last takers before we go into final comments? I see another Swedish colleague actually commenting that the latest OECD report on below market financing showed that subsidies are negatively correlated with the productivity of firms. So subsidies are not making Chinese become more competitive. Important to keep in mind. On that, I agree, and I would actually also like to point to a few studies that have been done on Chinese studies by the Chinese themselves. There is a wonderful piece that has been written by a scholar at the at Beijing Academy, which basically says that subsidies are like natural disasters. Of course, even natural disasters have beneficiaries because construction companies benefit from them, but you don't wish them upon your country. And this is actually in a Chinese study. What we have seen, especially in the tech sector, is that if governments start to subsidize them, they stop innovating. And therefore, they become like pets. You own them because they will not be surviving without you actually feeding them year on year. It's never a one-off. Okay, so since we have no hands, oh, Per, I see now that you're raising your hands. I'm going to allow you to talk. You want to come in?
Yes, please. Thank you, Hosuk, and thank you for a very interesting discussion here. I have a question that concerns the assessment, impact assessment of this new regulation. We are concerned from the board that there has been no basically general equilibrium assessment of this and how would it impact the EU economy. And then I read the summary of costs and benefits in the impact assessment. And then it says improved level playing field between companies could not be quantified, economic growth not possible to quantify, and it goes on. Notification of subsidy acquisition direct cost, none, indirect cost not possible to quantify, etc. There are basically no quantification of the effects of this regulation. And in my mind, that's a very weak way to base an evidence-based policy. So we still don't see the evidence that should support this new regulation. And that's a concern, even in the Commission's own impact assessment. Why don't you want to do this more thoroughly before you present the new regulation?
Wow. Remember what I said about Brussels and Geneva and cordiality? That's straight talk right there from my friend Per Altenberg of National Border Trade in Sweden. What I'm going to do now is that I'm going to allow Eddie, Benedict, Carolina, and Eva to say last final words while I ask Eddie to gather his notes. Maybe I can ask Benedict to go first. Do you have anything final words you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Thanks, Hosuk. Not really. It's been a very interesting discussion. Many interesting points have been made. Just to say that, I mean, we've of course had a look at the legislative proposal, and we will soon come up with a more detailed position paper on it. But our first assessment already showed that, broadly speaking, many of our comments and concerns with regards to the white paper have been taken on board, especially the fact that the Commission is the sole authority that will implement the regulation is very important to us, because that will allow uniform application across the single market, and that will also increase legal certainty for companies. But on many other aspects, we'll also have a look. But of course, yeah, I'll repeat again the main things that are important for us. On the one hand, WTO compliance. On the other hand, that the instrument is focused and minimizes administrative burden for companies and public administrations as much as possible, while remaining effective. So maybe, you know, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Carolina?
Sure, thank you. And what I really want to say probably is, as a lawyer, that I think this is good if you want to take, and what we're talking about, try to export this through some multilateral scheme. That what's good about introducing this in the EU is, I find, and this is a completely personal comment, but that this will be tested and tried in EU courts, presumably. So, and having this idea of, I mean, we have both trade remedies, an abundance of trade remedy cases in the EU courts. We have an abundance of case law when it comes to competition. So we're somewhere in between in this area, right? So I think we'll have a lot of jurisprudence to rely on if decisions will be tested. And I'm assuming that will be, if there's so many more lawyers and public servants dealing with this and a lot of cases, then over this whole expected new case law that'll come out, we have the EU Statute of Fundamental Rights guaranteeing, certain procedural elements. So I think going back to my comment that if this is moving forward the positions and saying we have a system or a regime that works, at least we can defend it from a procedural point of view, that presumably the EU courts will sort of guarantee that there'll be due process and all those legal lawyerish things that us lawyers look to defend or quash a decision.
No, indeed, we are a dynamic legal system, or someone might say we make up things as we go along. Actually, ECJ does. Eva, do you want to come in here, say a few words? A lot of these topics have concern about WTO, much more than I expected in this conversation when we started, to be honest. So Eva, take it away.
Stepping on the feet of lawyers, I'll just draw the examples of the recently wrapped up. Is it so? The civil aircraft crusade. I'll just encourage everyone to work towards not making semiconductors the follow-up of this saga, and instead learning the lessons where we can. I think Caroline already mentioned that the negotiations is a way to go. What I will add, it's apparently a much cheaper way to go ahead, and yet the time to act is now. I think I referred already that the WTO is not really known for its speed, yet the leadership is important. I'll stop here.
Sounds good. And well, Airbus, Boeing, yeah, that's actually a good parallel. Unfortunately, Wouter is no longer with us. He had to go, but I wonder if tech sector, at least one of the tech sectors, could be the next Airbus Boeing saga, where we have to exhaust all the legal remedies until we realize that we should have stopped billing the lawyers and actually start talking to each other about things that we both do. But Eddie, there has been a lot of questions and also comments coming in. Overall positive, I gotta say, and in a way that I didn't necessarily expect when we started this conversation. Would you like to have the final words and also respond to Per's question as well?
Yes, very, very happy to host. So quite a responsibility to give me the last word in what was a very rich conversation, of which I have the impression that we should continue. We could continue for hours. Think that people may be queuing for lunch by now, but let's have a conversation continued later. I noted down quite a lot of issues here. I'll take them randomly. Eva at some point mentioned indeed what the weaknesses are of today's WTO system, not only the limitation in scope to the subsidized imports of goods, but also that the dispute resolution mechanism as we know it in the WTO doesn't really give the relief that we are looking for, is it? And the Boeing Airbus is a case at point where you see indeed that it has taken, I think, over a decade to get this provisionally solved. Let's see how the saga continues. Nobody wants this to be repeated in lots of other sectors. So again, to strengthen the WTO multilateral system is the best solution. That is what we should try first of all. I noted Eva saying we should put our mouth to, or deeds to where our mouth is. I can only refer back to last week's statement at the occasion of the EU-US summit, where again the two parties pledged to modernize and to take steps in the modernization. It's for the colleagues of trade in a further discussion to tell you about what steps are being taken in that context. The impact assessment, happy that Per read it so carefully. I don't think that Per means to say that we have not provided any data in the impact assessment. We do as much as they are available. Difficulty though is that there is only a very scarce availability of data. On the questions indeed, to quantify the effects of the regulation, well, we prefer to give an honest response rather than giving a simulation based on necessarily limited data available. And the honest response is that we cannot tell you what today, what in 10 years from now will be quantitatively the effects of the regulation. Does that mean that there is not a problem to be solved? I don't think so. I hope that everybody agrees that foreign subsidization can be distortive on the internal market and needs to be remedied. As Per brought the quote in from the OECD, indeed, it's the subsidies that negatively correlate to the productivity of firms. But at the same time, it is these subsidized companies that are winning public procurement proceedings, crowding out more innovative companies. They are winning in acquisition because of the subsidization, to the detriment of competitors who would have been maybe on the merits a better acquirer. That is why we need to act. Subsidies can be good, and they can have a positive effect, and that links to the question from that we had earlier. You mentioned also on developing countries. Of course, there are benefits from subsidization, and one should take that into account also when looking at the distortive effect of possible foreign subsidization, which is why we have introduced in the draft regulation the balancing test. And it's not only the distortive effects that should determine the remedies that later on need to be taken, but also the positive effects that these subsidies may have, both in the domestic market of the subsidizing entity and in the EU market. Final comment that I wrote down from Benedict, and I very much agree that we should avoid at all costs unnecessary red tape. Administrative burden should be limited to what is necessary. I'm not saying that there won't be an additional cost for undertakings, because we are asking for notifications, but you will have appreciated, I hope, that we have put the threshold for the notifications at a sufficiently high bar in order to make sure that the notification obligation is not an unnecessary administrative burden for industry. If there were other issues that you would like me to comment on, Hosik, please let me know, but those were the points that I had noted.
We'll have to organize a second event around this, as sure that I'll see the debate continue going onwards. I see the Wouter is back, so I'm gonna actually end with you, Wouter, with just a quick question. Is semiconductors possibly the next Airbus Boeing? Or should I rephrase the question by saying, are you guys lawyering up for 10 years of trade disputes, or are you taking a different approach?
I think there is, I think that might be a bit of a stretch, but I think there is increasing tension that is going to culminate into something. So let's see how that materializes. But for now, I think in the spirit of last week, I obviously have to say that, you know, we're in a sort of positive phase of the transatlantic relationship. So, you know, an Airbus Boeing type dispute on semicon is in that spirit unlikely at this stage.
I'm very glad to hear and end on that transatlantic kumbaya. And also, I will thank all my excellent speakers and apologize for the poor moderating that led us to 10 minutes over time. So thank you all, and thank you to all who have contributed and listening today. Thank you so much, and please do get in touch with us or the panelists with your specific questions or other discussion you'd like to raise. If any of you who are listening are interested in us continuing the conversation on foreign subsidy regulation or subsidies in general, please do get in touch with us and for new ideas. And I'm sure that we have all the reason to invite all the people back. Thank you so much. All of you have spoken and listened, and enjoy your lunch. And well, apologies for the bad moderation. Thanks.
Thank you.
You did
Bye.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks.